you who haven't met me, my name is Luke Wortley. I'm the program coordinator for the Upper Midwest Telehealth Resource Center and the resource development coordinator for our parent organization, the Indiana Rural Health Association. For those of you who have called our 800 number or emailed info@UMTRC, my name is usually the one that pops up, and my voice is the one you get on the other end of the phone. So we've been getting a lot of questions about documentation and consent when it comes to telehealth and telemedicine. So we figured we'll just go ahead and do an overview of all 4 of our states, all of which have pretty similar policies, but I want to make sure that just to ease your concerns and give you some peace of mind that you have one place to go to with all of the appropriate citations. So we'll start, I need to minimize this. So we'll start with Indiana. Informed consent in Indiana is located in Title 16, Section 2 of the Administrative Code. And basically what it amounts to is a fair explanation of an examination, including purposes, potential uses, limitations, and the fair meaning of the examination results, and that it must be voluntary. And so you can find the rest of the language here in this particular link of the Indiana Administrative Code. When it comes to documentation, though, Indiana Medicaid is relatively general, but here's a quotation from the actual provider's manual. So documentation must be maintained at the distant and originating locations to substantiate the services provided. So documentation must indicate that the services were rendered via telemedicine and must clearly identify the location of the distant and originating sites. Obviously, in a pre-COVID-19 world, the originating site was limited to a very specific set of locations during or as listed elsewhere in the code. Obviously now all of those originating sites have been expanded dramatically. But just because a patient is in their home doesn't mean that you don't need to document it as if they were at any other valid originating site. So again, this is the link to that, and you can see the rest of the language surrounding documentation and originating sites. So maybe that's a good place to go ahead and pause. Becky, are there any questions in the chat yet?
No, please use the Q&A for questions.
Okay.
And only use the chat if you have technical questions. And the reason we do that is because in the Q&A, then we can record it if there's any questions that we don't get to today, because we're only blocked off for half an hour for the virtual office hours. Then we can get back with you later and let everybody know. So we do have a question. Question is, so do we need to document where the patient is at for the televisit?
Yes, so that should absolutely be noted. And obviously their consent must be made available to the patient at any time. So, so yeah, documentation maintained at both the distant and originating sites. And yeah, you should absolutely note where they are. I hope that answers the questions. I think it's pretty cut and dried on that. All right, so we'll go on to our next state. Get back here. So Illinois, per the Illinois Department of Health and Family Services, the only actual quoted language is the patient must verbally consent to receive virtual check-in services, and this was issued in conjunction with other executive orders in the middle of March. And according to the Illinois Administrative Code, at the point of admission for services, licensed organizations must obtain written informed consent as defined in sections 1 through 10 in an administrative rule from client, patient, or legal guardian. And I'm going to go ahead and show you what a further definition of informed consent is. defined as permission for procedure freely granted by a person or persons authorized by law. So again, it's a very similar language to Indiana, and as of right now, obviously, written consent for new patients and even existing ones for telemedicine encounters is somewhat impossible. So I'm going to get to that particular component of it at the very end and talk about the language that CMS has been using, as well as our recommendations as your telehealth resource center. When it comes to documentation standards, here's again links to the appropriate sections and chapters of Title 89 of the Illinois Administrative Code. Basically, you keep medical records documenting telemedicine encounters or telehealth services the exact same way as you would any other in-person visit. And the records that are required for that in-person visit or regular retention of records, I've actually went ahead and given you a citation of that as well if you want to go in and check out what those are.
Hey, Luke, someone is having your voice cut out a little bit. It might be on their end only, but could you speak a little bit slower just
Sure.
in case? Thanks.
Sure, yeah. So in case you didn't catch that, the Illinois Administrative Code in terms of retention of records basically uses the exact same language as in-person visits. And all of that language can be found in this particular section 403, but for a more granular breakdown of the required records, I've also included a link to that section of Title 89 as well. So we'll move on to Michigan, our next state. So per Chapter 333, as an extension of the old act that was passed in the 1970s, a lot of these laws got revised in the early 90s and then again in the mid 2000s. So that's where this language comes from. Basically, consent was required except as otherwise provided in this section. A health professional shall not provide a telehealth service without directly or indirectly obtaining consent for treatment. So Michigan is very clear on the fact that even for telehealth services, informed consent is required. And here is the other stuff that is referenced in terms of retention of records. Again, Michigan is very clear, has a specific breakdown of what it is that they want. That section 16213 of the Michigan compiled laws goes on for a few more paragraphs, but this is the meat of the matter, so to speak. But really the best breakdown that I saw for Michigan in terms of what should be documented and how regarding telemedicine or telehealth services is in pages 51 to 56 of the Michigan Medicaid Provider Manual that I've linked right here. Just a fair warning that the PDF of the Michigan Medicaid Provider Manual, the numbers won't match up to the actual pages. So you may have to scroll a little further than just trying to go to page 51 on the PDF. It may just not line up right away if you're viewing it on a screen. I saw a notification for a question there, Becky.
Yeah, this is a good one. Do we have to document consent for telephone only visits?
I would assume so. That didn't really come up in my research, mostly because it seemed as though Medicare and CMS at the beginning of that telehealth extension waiver were going to allow telephone visits for pretty much everything. And so I would say, just to be safe, I think you should, but also it just depends on whether or not you're going to, actually administer services that you're going to get reimbursed for. So I'm not exactly sure what that is. I might have to get back to you on that one because there isn't a whole lot in the administrative code or the compiled laws in the case of Michigan in any of our 4 states that specifically talk about telephone only or audio only.
Yeah, I agree. But if because I haven't seen it, and that's a great question. I haven't seen anything about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, my advice, I agree with you, Luke, is go ahead and document it, because especially if you are going to bill it, you don't want somebody coming back later and saying, hey, you didn't document consent, therefore we're not going to reimburse you for this.
Right. So we'll go ahead and move on to our last state. Ohio's last executive order, or the first executive order really, that pertained to the extension of telemedicine services in Ohio, stated in mid-March again, quote, providers must document their use of telemedicine and meet minimum standards of care, end quote. And it might seem that I'm going a little bit backwards in this, but I think it's important to outline minimal standards of care. Ohio was the most accessible out of our 4 states in being able to find clearly defined standards of care. And funnily enough, these were outlined very specifically in the section of the revised code that have to do with medical marijuana prescription. So I think that these are good things to keep in mind in terms of minimal standard of care, regardless of what the treatment modality is or the actual purpose of the telemedicine visit. And again, I've linked the language of that executive order up there as well. So when it comes to actually informed consent, Ohio defines it very similarly as the other 3 states. There's a couple stipulations right here, and I went ahead and linked that language as well. That there has to be voluntary consent, that it has to be outlined very clearly by the provider and understood by the patient, that they can't have any sort of mental impairment without sufficient representation, that sort of thing. And when it comes to Ohio, they had the least amount of language when it came to documentation standards. So I had to do a little bit of extra digging. Basically, Chapter 5150 of the Administrative Code says that the practitioner site must have access to medical records of the patient at the time of service and is responsible for maintaining documentation in accordance with paragraph C1 of this rule. And I went ahead and put C1 there as well, basically ensuring HIPAA compliance and confidentiality as revised in January of 2019. So I went and tried to find even further breakdowns of it, and I was able to find the general medical record requirements in terms of retention. And HCF in this case stands for healthcare facility. So these are all readily available through this link here as well. But Ohio is very general in terms of what is considered documented. So if you have a specific question about a specific instance, I might have to do just a little bit more digging. All right, so that's a good overview, I think, of where we are at this point. So let's talk about what this functionally means. It's nice to have the citation and know that you're, being pursuant to your state's laws and that kind of thing, but how does that actually impact you when you're trying to deliver care to somebody? And so I think the best way to do it, since CMS has suspended, HIPAA sanctions for non-encrypted platforms, whatever platform you've chosen is up to you. And when you're using it in a two-way audio-visual synchronous way, obtaining verbal consent is probably the best way to document at this particular point. And the way that I would recommend doing it is basically pulling up, we have a sample consent form right here, or if you already have one, trying to keep it at one page so it can all be viewed on one screen without too much scrolling is probably a good idea. And just to be safe, I would not only allow the patient to read and give informed consent, but I would also read aloud to them just to make sure that everything, like all the T's have been crossed, all the I's have been dotted. And again, pursuant to your state's documentation and retention of records laws, just make sure that you know where they are, what they're signing up for, that sort of thing. All right, so I'll pause there before I get to our final slide and then kind of open it up for more general questions. Are there any other specific questions about consent forms or how to interpret CMS's relaxed HIPAA sanctions or anything like that?
As a reminder, go ahead and enter your questions in the Q&A if you have any questions at this time. Yes, we will send out a link to the PowerPoints on the UMTRC.org website. We have a section for events, and then there's a subsection for archived webinars. We will post both the recording and the slides on that page. And as a registrant of today's virtual office hours session, that link will be emailed to you once everything has been posted.
And in conjunction with that, I went ahead and linked our specific resources that go along with all of this, right? So each state on our website has their own COVID-19 page, and we have a general FAQ up as well. We have previously recorded webinars, other resources, and so this is just one of many things that hopefully will answer your general telehealth questions. I saw a couple questions come in.
Yeah, we're starting to get questions that are more general, not necessarily regarding consent. So I'm going to answer the consent questions first. Do you recommend sending the consent via patient portal for the patient to review beforehand?
If that's an option, I think absolutely. Any number of ways that you can document that they've seen it, that they've heard it, and that they've agreed to it.
Great, thank you. Okay, so 3 questions going off in various different ways. Let's talk about this one first. I'm a community paramedic, so a lot of my folks don't have computers. So what I'm hearing is that I can use a phone consent. So that's really 2 questions there, I see.
If you're just trying to get consent, verbal consent that way, I think is okay as long as it's documented. Whether or not you're going to get paid for any service via telephone is another issue entirely.
Yeah, and community paramedics, to my knowledge, don't have the ability to actually bill
Right.
and normally get paid via contract with a hospital.
Right.
And I know that's another issue that like community health workers, Indiana Medicaid finally does now pay for. Oh, okay. Yeah, if you're not worried about payment, yeah, phone consent is fine.
Yeah, then that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
All right. If I remember right off the top of my head, and I think they're talking about a telephone service code. So for 9944X codes, should providers document time spent, and does prep time and time ordering and documenting count in this time?
That's a good question. To answer the very first part of it, yes, you should keep track of how much time is spent because there's a particular time frame attached to those codes in terms of what's actually a billable encounter. But the other stuff, I think, Becky, you and I might have to ask around for that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the prep time and time ordering and documenting counts for a telephone service code. We'll get back to you on that one.
And if for whatever reason, Becky and I get bogged down right after this call, I've listed our service or our contact information as well as the general UMTRC contact information. So if we don't follow up with you super quick, just reach out and give us a little bit of a nudge. As you can imagine, our requests have been coming in pretty hot and heavy over the last few weeks.
This last one gets into another area. Oh, I know we're starting to get some more questions. Okay, so are there preferred platforms others are using, and I'm assuming for telemedicine visits? Do you want to take that one, or do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, so we as a federally funded agency don't actually recommend vendors just because that might violate the contracts of our federal funding. But I do have a resource here from the National Technology or National Telehealth Technology Assessment and Resource Center. And that's what this technology toolkits link is. They've done a lot of the good work of actually evaluating what works for what types of visits and modalities and that sort of thing. We don't have enough resources to provide a fully exhaustive list, which would be vendor agnostic. So we just can't recommend that for you. So that's why I included that link.
Something else to note, early on in this public health emergency with COVID-19, each state Medicaid program put out information regarding HIPAA compliance, and we've talked about that today, and it's kind of waived right now. So states are allowing you to use non-HIPAA compliant platforms like FaceTime and Skype and Google Hangouts. We really recommend, if we're kind of making the assumption that you're going to be in this for the long term, you're not going to stop doing telemedicine after this public health emergency is over. And we really do encourage HIPAA compliant platforms, and the toolkit that Luke suggested does specifically talk just about HIPAA compliant platforms.
Mm-hmm.
Another question. Our OP hospital, I'm making an assumption that means outpatient hospital, DSMT, so I'm assuming diabetic self-management training program, is having difficulty with billing Medicare, not reimbursing for a facility fee when a person is in their home. Oh, yeah. So, yeah. If somebody is at home, it's not what we would call an eligible originating site. It's just something during this public health emergency. You're not going to be able to bill that facility fee when the patient's at home because they're not at a clinical site. All right. Any last minute questions before we end today's session? All right. Well, thank you very much, Luke, for doing all that research and presenting it. And hopefully this will help answer some questions, and you've got contact information and links for additional information. So thanks for joining us today. Oh, one more thing, because we are, did I lose it? Oh, here it is. A federally funded organization, we always like feedback. And in the chat, I am going to go ahead and give you a link to a real short Survey Monkey so you can tell us how we're doing and what we can do better. I have a question. What about VS? I'm not even going to try to guess what you mean by VS. Please give us some more information. Vital signs. Luke, you want to talk about vital signs?
Yeah, so obviously, if you're not in person with the patient, vitals are going to be reliant on the patient giving you information. So, I mean, and that can be, you know, any number of things. I think, you know, some places require 3 vital signs, you know, some, you know, depending on what they have available, you're just going to have to rely on them and document accordingly, you know, height, weight, if they've got a blood pressure cuff, that's great. A thermometer, you know, if they've got a fitness app on their phone or something like that, that keeps track of their pulse, you know, they can hold that up to the screen. You have to get a little creative, and you have to rely on your patients in that case.
Yep, absolutely. All right, well, thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day.